Hello, Mr. Wall.
Hi, Dustin. How are you?
I'm excellent. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm not so bad. Thank you very much.
Well, it's great to have you on, and I'm excited about the new book, Black Sabbath, Symptoms of the Universe. Can you tell the listeners a bit about that?
Well, what the book tries to do is something that no other book about Ozzy or Black Sabbath has ever done, which is actually take the subject seriously. So you have the whole incredible saga of Ozzy and Sabbath going back to their childhoods in the 1950s, right through the incredible success of the 1970s, and then into the really crazy times of the 80s and the 90s where Sabbath fire Ozzy, have a great career with his replacement Ronnie Dio, then fall out with him and get a succession of new singers in that steadily kind of erodes the image and reputation of Black Sabbath, at the same time as Ozzy goes on to have an amazing solo career guided by Sharon Osbourne. Ronnie Dio, he has a better career in the 80s than Sabbath. And bringing the story right up to the present day, covering Ronnie's sad death in 2010. Ronnie, who I knew very well. I've known all of them very well. And literally up to the present day where we have this incredible situation where the original guys get back together to make their first album for, 30-odd years. But then Bill Ward, the drummer, decides he doesn't want to do it. I mean, it's just every chapter in the Black Sabbath story, there is a new twist, a new unexpected turn. A lot of laughs, a lot of tears, death, tragedy, triumph, success. You name it, it's in there.
Yeah, definitely a crazy story for sure. And I know you became the publicist for the band kind of around that kind of tumultuous time in the late 70s. That must have been difficult to come into that camp right around that time when things were kind of boiling over at that point.
It was. I mean, thankfully, I was so young. I didn't know any different. I mean, I was 20, 21, and working at a music PR firm in London, and I was sent to Paris to hook up with Sabbath, who just fired Ozzy. Were finishing making their first album without Ozzy, which was their first album with Ronnie Dio. And it was hugely tense because they weren't sure if they'd be able to carry on without Ozzy, whether people would find it believable. And a lot rested on how the media accepted the whole thing. So there was a lot of responsibility on my shoulders to try and, help them make this thing happen. But it did. I mean, that was the crazy thing. It really did. And the first album they did with Dio, Heaven and Hell, became their biggest seller since their heyday in the mid-70s. So, but I mean, I went on. They were the first band to bring me to America. I mean, a lot of firsts for me occurred with Black Sabbath.
Yeah, and you mentioned that time in the 80s when things were pretty rough and, eventually even Bill Ward and Geezer left, a lot of people coming in and out. Did you kind of get the sense from Tony Iommi that, just more success was right around the corner if he just stuck with it, or do you kind of get a sense of where he was at that point?
Very much so. I mean, you have to remember, Tony these days is a very different guy to who he was in the 70s and 80s. As he'll be happy to tell you, he had a very big cocaine habit in the 70s and 80s, and as did all of them, by the way. But Tony was the leader of the band. It was Tony that had cracked the whip in the early days, Tony that wrote all the music. This was always Tony's band, and so he always had the final word on everything. It was Tony that decided Ozzy had to go. It was Tony that brought Ronnie Dio in. And the thing is, here was the bit where Tony made his big mistake. If he had to fire Ozzy, okay, Ozzy was utterly out of control at the time. Bringing Dio in was a masterstroke, and the two albums they did, both platinum in America, both big albums for them. But then Tony made his big mistake, which was suddenly taking it all for granted. He'd got over the worst. He'd fired Ozzy. After that, he's bulletproof. Nothing can go wrong. But he falls out with Dio. Dio is not a drug guy. Dio likes beer and likes Indian food. And he and Tony just, Johnny was a tough New York guy. He wasn't about to take orders from anybody, and they fell out. And that really was the beginning of the end for Black Sabbath. And although Tony struggled on for another, nearly 20 years with different singers, at one time, Tony was the only original member left in the band.
Sure.
And it kind of became untenable. You want to go and see Black Sabbath, but there's no one there from Black Sabbath apart from Tony. So it was kind of a sad story. But now with a happy ending because, they're back and they're better than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. A great ending to the story and, still going on. And I got to ask you, you mentioned you started right around your early 20s with Sabbath, and that must have been a crazy time, of course. Would you say they were the craziest band that you've had to deal with? I know you've had trouble with Axl Rose in the past and those sorts of things. So would they be on the top, would you say?
They would definitely be on the top. I mean, I did a lot of work with Guns N' Roses at the height of their fame, before they got famous, while they were famous. But I promise you, that was a piece of cake compared to working with Black Sabbath. I mean, it got to the point, which the book explains, that after I came back from my first trip to America with Black Sabbath, I was ready to quit the business. I mean, these guys were just too weird, too crazy. They'd been round the block so many times with Ozzy. I remember we did 2 nights at Madison Square Garden in New York, did a couple of nights at the Forum in LA, a big arena tour. And they would come off stage and nothing. No big kind of vibe, no joyous occasion, just a lot of bickering and fighting and arguing. And then Bill walks out and, oh my God, it was just havoc. But, that so often happens with these great rock and roll bands. Kind of when they're at each other's throats is sometimes when they make their best music. And the thing is, Sabbath really were on form in those years, and like I say, seeing them do 2 sold-out nights at Madison Square Garden and seeing that crazy New York crowd really embrace them, that's something I will never forget.
Yeah, very cool for sure. And Mick, I wish we could talk to you longer. I know we're out of time here, but looking forward to the book, Black Sabbath, Symptoms of the Universe, and it's available everywhere. Thanks a lot for being on with me today.
Thank you, Dustin. It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.